The dense rainforest was alive with the sounds of nature, birds calling in the distance, insects buzzing in a steady hum, and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the occasional breeze. The air was thick, humid and warm, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Rain had fallen the night before, leaving droplets clinging to the leaves like crystal beads. Every step was a careful negotiation between solid ground and hidden roots that snaked through the underbrush. A solitary figure moved through the dense forest. Emma, a seasoned wildlife researcher. Her mission was simple: to observe the rare species of birds that thrived deep in this secluded part of the Amazon. Armed with nothing but her journal, camera, and an uncanny ability to move quietly through the jungle, she had spent the past week documenting the unique species that had made this isolated stretch of forest their home. But today, something felt different. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As Emma ventured deeper, the sounds of the jungle began to feel muffled, like they were being suppressed by an unseen force. Birds that were usually abundant had fallen silent. The usual chatter of monkeys and the chirps of insects seemed to have ceased. Emma paused, her senses heightened. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She had been in this forest for weeks now, and although she had often felt the weight of the jungle's presence, today was unlike any other. She couldn't pinpoint it. There was no clear danger, no obvious threat, but something was wrong. She continued on, though, determined to reach a clearing she had discovered a few days ago. It was a small oasis of tranquility, surrounded by trees that had been there for centuries. The clearing was perfect for observing the vibrant parrots that made their nests in the high branches. Emma had always been drawn to them, their bright plumage and fascinating behaviors. But this time, her steps were slower, more deliberate, as if the ground beneath her feet could give way at any moment. The first sound came unexpectedly, a sharp, jarring squawk from above. Emma froze, scanning the canopy. High above, perched on a branch with its bright green feathers standing out against the dark backdrop of the trees, was a parrot. It stared down at her, its eyes wide and unblinking. Another shrill call broke the silence, followed by a few more from different areas around her. The sound grew louder, more frantic. Emma had never heard parrots act like this. They were known for their vibrant calls, but this was different. These squawks were erratic, filled with urgency, almost as if they were trying to communicate something vital. She tried to calm herself, remembering the countless hours spent studying animal behavior, but the forest had shifted around her, as if it had become a living entity, turning hostile. The branches overhead swayed in unnatural rhythms, like something was moving through them with great speed, though she could see nothing. Her instincts told her to leave, to turn back, but curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. The parrot's calls became louder, more dissonant, filling the air with a chaotic symphony of warnings. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she strained her eyes to catch sight of any movement in the trees. Then, in a moment of clarity, she noticed something. The parrots weren't just calling to each other. Their eyes were fixed on her, their calls directed at her, as though they were trying to tell her something. A sudden chill ran down Emma's spine. She had heard stories of animals sensing danger before humans could, of them reacting to a predator's approach long before it was visible. The parrot's warning was real. She turned quickly, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of movement. The air had grown colder, and the jungle, once alive with noise, had become eerily silent once again. Emma took a step back, instinctively moving toward the trail that would lead her back to camp, but as she did, she saw it. A flash of dark movement between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be any of the usual jungle creatures. God! Unable to restrain her enthusiasm, her breath caught in her throat as she froze, trying to make sense of the shadow she had glimpsed. Then it was gone, swallowed by the thick foliage. The parrot's calls erupted in a frenzy, more frantic than before. Emma's pulse quickened, and she felt the weight of the forest pressing in on her. She had to leave. The ground beneath her feet suddenly shifted. A loud snap echoed through the jungle, and before she could react, the underbrush around her began to tremble. Something large, something powerful was moving through the forest toward her, its presence undeniable. She turned and bolted, her heart racing as she dashed through the trees. Her breath was shallow, her legs burning with the effort. The path ahead was unclear, and the dense foliage made it impossible to see where she was going. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the undergrowth felt like it was closing in on her, a reminder that she was not alone. The parrot's calls continued, but now they seemed to echo from every direction, like 1,000 voices crying out in warning. Emma's mind raced as she fought to keep her bearings, but the jungle seemed to shift and twist around her, disorienting her every step. Then, just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she broke through the dense foliage and into the clearing she had been aiming for. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, but there was no sense of relief. The air was thick with tension, and the oppressive silence that had settled over the forest weighed heavily on her chest. The parrots were now silent. No calls, no rustling. It was as if the jungle itself had fallen completely still. Emma's eyes scanned the clearing. The only movement was the distant sway of the trees. She waited, breath held, her mind racing. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, reached her ears. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged, a large, silent shape that moved with the grace of a predator. But it wasn't an animal. It was human. A figure she had never seen before. Tall, gaunt, and covered in layers of mud and leaves, as though they had been living in the forest for years. The eyes of the figure locked onto hers, and Emma's stomach dropped. The parrots had been warning her not of an animal, but of this human presence. Someone who had become part of the jungle, lost to time, surviving in the very wilderness she had come to study. Someone who knew the forest better than any creature could. And they had been watching her, just as she had been watching the parrots. Emma backed away slowly, the tension thick in the air. The figure didn't move toward her, but it didn't leave either. They stood there, locked in an unspoken understanding, before the figure turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees. For a long moment, the jungle was still once more. The parrots had gone silent. The tension in the air seemed to linger, a warning that Emma would not soon forget. Emma remained frozen, her pulse still hammering in her chest. Her eyes darted to the place where the figure had disappeared into the shadows, but there was no sign of movement, no rustling in the undergrowth. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole. She slowly rose to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her, still unsure whether the figure had been a hallucination or if it had been something far worse. A remnant of the jungle itself, a person lost to time, surviving at its mercy. Her mind struggled to piece together what she had just witnessed, the parrots, the strange behavior of the forest, and now this mysterious figure. Everything had shifted in a way that defied logic. Emma turned her attention back to the clearing, her gaze sweeping the quiet surroundings. The trees swayed gently, as if nothing had happened at all. But something in the air had changed. It was no longer just the jungle surrounding her. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The silence felt suffocating. For a moment, she considered turning back to her camp, seeking the safety of familiar ground. But she knew deep down that the forest wasn't finished with her yet. She had no choice but to move forward. The feeling that she was being watched, that she was no longer in control, had grown too intense to ignore. With a deep breath, she began to walk cautiously toward the dense trees ahead, moving slowly and deliberately. The forest felt different now. The air was cooler, the foliage more oppressive, as though the very land was aware of her presence. Her every step seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the unnerving stillness around her. She had barely taken a few steps when she heard it again, the unmistakable call of a parrot. But this time it wasn't frantic or erratic. It was soft, steady, almost rhythmic. She stopped and turned toward the sound, her heart skipping a beat. High above in the trees, a parrot appeared, its brilliant green feathers flashing in the sunlight. But it wasn't alone. More appeared, dozens of them, flocking together in the canopy. They weren't making the chaotic noises they had before. Instead, their calls seemed deliberate, synchronized, as though they were guiding her. The parrot at the forefront locked eyes with her, its gaze unwavering. It tilted its head slightly, as though it was waiting for her to understand something that had eluded her until now. Emma hesitated. Could the parrots be leading her somewhere? Were they offering a warning? Or an invitation? She took another step forward, feeling the pull of the birds' presence, their silent command. The parrots moved, their vibrant colors flashing through the leaves as they shifted their positions. As she followed, she became acutely aware of the forest's strange stillness. No more animal calls, no more rustling in the leaves, just the rhythmic beating of her own heart and the occasional soft call from the parrots. It was as if the entire jungle had gone quiet for her. The deeper she ventured, the more intense the feeling of unease became. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker and more twisted, as if they were ancient sentinels, standing guard over something far older than she could comprehend. The air grew dense, thick with the smell of moss and decay, and still, the parrots led her onward, unwavering in their flight, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The jungle, once a beautiful and vibrant environment, now felt like a place of secrets, dark, silent, and pregnant with something unknown. Emma's mind raced. She had been here many times before, but now it seemed like a completely different world. The jungle wasn't merely a backdrop, it was an active force, watching her, guiding her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustle in the undergrowth. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze. The parrots overhead took flight, their wings flapping loudly as they scattered in all directions. Emma's eyes scanned the trees, the ground, but there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the forest. Then she saw it. At the corner of her eye, through the tangled vines and branches, she saw the same figure she had glimpsed earlier. It was moving through the trees with a fluidity that was almost unnatural. This time, the figure was closer, its silhouette unmistakable against the thick shadows. Emma's legs stiffened and she instinctively took a step backward, but the figure did not approach. Instead, it paused, and for a long moment their eyes locked. Emma could see the figure's hollow, tired gaze, and something in their expression made her stomach churn. There was a depth to that gaze, a wisdom and weariness that seemed to span centuries. And in it, Emma saw something chilling. The weight of isolation, the knowledge of the jungle's secrets, and the warning of something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The figure turned slowly, their movements deliberate, as though they were giving her one last chance to leave. Emma could feel her pulse quickening, her senses heightened to the point of panic. She wanted to run, to escape, but something deep inside her held her in place. She had come too far to turn back now. The jungle had drawn her in, and now it was showing her the cost. The figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The parrots returned to their perch, but their calls had changed. No longer rhythmic, they were now a low, mournful cry, like a final warning, an omen. Emma stood in the heart of the jungle, torn between her instinct to flee and the overwhelming pull to continue. She glanced around one last time, her eyes lingering on the dense forest, the tangled vines, and the eerie stillness that surrounded her. The parrots fell silent again, and for a moment, everything was still. Too still. Then, in the distance, she heard it. A low, distant growl like the rumble of thunder, but far more menacing. It was coming closer. The growl echoed through the jungle like a primal warning, sending a cold shiver down Emma's spine. It wasn't the growl of any animal she recognized. Too deep, too guttural, as though it came from something larger, something ancient. Hidden beneath the dense foliage, the air around her seemed to crackle with tension, the weight of the jungle pressing down on her with a suffocating force. The parrots, who had been eerily silent for a moment, suddenly erupted into frantic squawks. Their wings beat furiously as they took off in a rush, scattering in every direction, leaving Emma standing alone in the oppressive quiet. She felt as if the very earth beneath her was shifting, aligning in some unfathomable way, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. Her heart raced, and instinctively she took a step backward, her body screaming at her to flee. The growl grew louder, closer, its deep resonance vibrating in her chest. It was too late to turn back now. She had come too far, passed too deep into the heart of this jungle, a place that seemed alive with secrets and forces beyond her comprehension. Emma's eyes darted to the trees around her, looking for any sign of movement, but the jungle was still, too still. The sound of her own breath seemed too loud, too frantic in the sudden silence. And then, from behind a cluster of dense vines, she saw it. Two yellow eyes, glowing faintly in the shadow. They were watching her, unblinking, filled with a cold intelligence. The growl was now unmistakable, vibrating from the throat of whatever creature hid just beyond the veil of foliage. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and her body froze. She knew she should move, should run, but the force of that gaze held her in place. The growl turned into a low rumble, the air around her vibrating, and for a fleeting moment, Emma's mind struggled to understand what she was seeing. It wasn't an animal at all, not in the way she had thought. What lay before her was something far older, something more primal, more deeply tied to the land than she could ever have imagined. The figure, what Emma had taken to be a human figure, stepped forward from the shadows, revealing a shape that was no longer entirely human. It was a creature of the jungle, something that had long ago blurred the line between man and animal. Its body was covered in fur and scars, its face twisted with a mixture of human features and something more feral. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing her reaction. Emma's mind raced. This was no lost traveler, no hermit who had simply wandered into the jungle. This was something far darker, something that belonged to the depths of the forest, a being forged by the untamed wildness of the world. A guardian, perhaps, or a predator. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a root. The growl rumbled again, deeper this time, the creature's eyes narrowing, a spark of recognition or warning flickering in the depths of its gaze. Emma's chest tightened and her legs screamed for her to run, but the jungle had her trapped. Every direction seemed to lead her deeper into its grip. The creature tilted its head slightly as though considering her, and Emma felt a sudden surge of terror. What did it want? Why had it appeared now? Was it her presence that had stirred the jungle to life, or had she unknowingly crossed into a forbidden space? The parrots had been trying to lead her away, trying to warn her, and now it was too late. The creature's growl softened, but its posture remained threatening. It reached up and pulled aside a heavy curtain of vines, revealing a small, dimly lit clearing behind it. Emma felt a pull toward the clearing, an inexplicable urge to move forward, but she knew it wasn't her choice. The jungle was pushing her, forcing her hand. As she stepped closer, the creature stepped aside, its yellow eyes never leaving her. It seemed to move with purpose now, guiding her into the heart of something ancient, something that had been hidden for generations. Emma's mind reeled with questions. What was this place? Who were these guardians of the jungle? And why had they revealed themselves to her now? But the answers never came. The deeper she went into the clearing, the more suffocating the air became and the more oppressive the silence felt. Then, as Emma crossed the threshold into the clearing, the ground shifted beneath her feet, a low rumble reverberating from deep in the earth. The creature's eyes flickered with recognition, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Before she could process what was happening, the air seemed to change. The clearing exploded with movement. First the trees, their branches shifting, and then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Emma's heart raced as she turned to flee, but the jungle itself seemed to rise up, preventing her escape. From the shadows emerged more figures. More of them. The jungle was alive with them. They moved silently, emerging from the dense foliage like ghosts, eyes glowing in the dim light. Their faces were more animal than human, their bodies twisted by time and survival. Emma's breath hitched as the figures surrounded her. She realized then that she had been drawn into a place where the line between human and beast had long since disappeared. A hidden tribe that lived by their own rules, governed by the jungle's ancient rhythms. These beings were protectors of the forest, its stewards and guardians, and Emma had unknowingly trespassed into their sacred domain.